Here's the expanded version, matching the original word count. Canada just did something that nobody in Washington saw coming. Not a threat, not a warning, not a strongly worded diplomatic letter that gets filed and forgotten in some bureaucratic drawer while staffers move on to the next crisis. Something quieter than that, something more deliberate. Something that the people who spend their entire careers mapping the architecture of global trade relationships are calling the most precisely targeted economic maneuver they have seen in decades. And the administration has not found a public response that addresses a single element of it. Not one. Not a retaliatory tariff, not a diplomatic protest note, not a strongly worded statement from anyone with the authority to make it mean something. Nothing that touches the actual substance of what Canada did. Nothing that engages with the architecture of it. Nothing that demonstrates even a basic understanding of what Thursday night actually was. Because here's what you need to understand before anything else. Before the instruments, before the numbers, before the specific sectors and the specific senators and the specific defense programs whose supply certainty just evaporated overnight. There's a difference between a country that retaliates and a country that restructures. And that difference is everything. Retaliation is noise. It's loud and it's visible and it generates headlines and press conferences and strongly worded statements from officials who appear before cameras and use language designed to signal resolve. But when the noise fades, when the cameras move to the next story and the press conferences are forgotten and the strongly worded statements have been filed away, the underlying structure of the relationship is exactly where it was before. The foundation didn't move. The dependency map didn't change. The leverage that existed before the retaliation still exists in exactly the same configuration. Retaliation imposes costs. Restructuring changes architecture. And what Canada did on Thursday night was not retaliation. It was architecture. 3 instruments, 1 night, deployed simultaneously on a deliberate timeline by a government that had spent 18 months preparing for exactly this moment. And by the time most of Washington had finished reading the morning briefings and understood what had actually happened, the leverage map of this entire dispute had already been redrawn in ways that no press availability and no tariff adjustment and no strongly worded statement is going to reverse. Stay with me. Because when you understand what each instrument actually does, who specifically bears the cost of each one, and why the sequencing of all 3 together is more significant than any one of them individually, you'll understand why people who have spent their entire careers in trade policy are saying they've never seen anything quite like this. You'll understand why veteran trade negotiators are describing Thursday night as the moment this dispute entered territory that neither side has navigated before. And you'll understand why the people whose job it is to map the relationship between political decisions and economic consequences are looking at what Canada built over 18 months and calling it, without exaggeration, breathtaking in its precision. Let's start with how Canada arrived at this moment, because context matters here in a way it rarely matters more. You cannot understand how significant this counterattack is without understanding how carefully the decision to build it was made, and how deliberately the preparation that followed that decision was executed. A decision this precise, this coordinated, this architecturally significant does not emerge from a reactive government making panicked choices under pressure. It does not emerge from officials responding to events faster than they can think through the consequences. It emerges from a government that made one specific, deliberate, consequential decision at a specific point in this dispute's history, and then spent 18 months preparing to execute it with the discipline of an institution that understood the window between preparation and deployment would eventually close, and that when it closed, the instruments needed to be ready. The decision was made in the weeks immediately following the failed bilateral meeting. The session that produced nothing and was followed by a public ultimatum that Canada refused on an international stage in 14 words. That moment of refusal was not the decision. The decision came in the quiet that followed, when the people doing the actual strategic thinking looked at the trajectory of the dispute, looked at the terrain on which it was being contested, and made a calculation that changed everything about how Canada would approach what came next. The decision was not to retaliate. Retaliation had already been tried. Tariff for tariff escalation had already been deployed and had already demonstrated its limits with a clarity that left no room for ambiguity about where that path led. And the people doing the planning understood something that the administration apparently did not. That tit for tat escalation always advantages the larger economy. Always. The bigger player can absorb the costs longer. The deeper pockets mean the pain accumulates more slowly. The more diversified economic base means the disruption distributes across a wider surface and hurts any single sector less. The smaller player is perpetually playing defense on terrain that favors its opponent. Every round of escalation on that terrain is a round the larger economy wins by not losing faster. So Canada made a different decision. Stop fighting on ground that favors the other side. Move the contest off that terrain entirely and start fighting on ground where the asymmetry runs in the opposite direction, where Canada holds leverage that had never been fully exercised, where the dependencies run deep and the substitution options run thin, and the timeline for finding alternatives runs longer than any political cycle either side is operating on. And then spend 18 months building the instruments to deploy on that terrain with surgical precision that tariff escalation cannot deliver and was never designed to deliver. The team assembled to do that building drew from 3 Canadian government ministries, the Bank of Canada's External Affairs Division, 2 provincial government economic councils, and a carefully selected group of academic economists whose expertise spanned trade law, critical mineral supply chains, and currency architecture in ways that don't often appear in the same room at the same time. Their mandate was narrow, deliberately, specifically narrow. Find the American economic sectors where Canadian supply is least replaceable in the short to medium term. Not theoretically replaceable after years of investment and infrastructure development and political will, actually replaceable in the months and quarters that matter for the trajectory of a live trade dispute. Find those sectors and design instruments that impose targeted, specific, measurable costs on them without triggering the kind of broad-based economic disruption that would harm Canadian households and Canadian businesses as much as American ones. The precision the mandate required is the precision that traditional tariff escalation cannot deliver. Tariffs are blunt. They impose costs broadly, across categories, across sectors, across households and businesses that had nothing to do with the decisions that created the dispute. The instruments Canada was building were designed to be the opposite of blunt, designed to land on specific sectors, specific constituencies, specific political pressure points, with the kind of accuracy that transforms a trade dispute from a contest of economic endurance into something more targeted, more architectural, more difficult to respond to because the response requires engaging with specifics that a general tariff adjustment cannot address. They delivered on that mandate. And here is what delivery looked like. What actually happened on Thursday night in the administrative infrastructure of 3 separate governments, not in a conference room or a diplomatic chamber or on a stage with podiums and cameras. In the quiet machinery of departments executing pre-drafted instruments on a pre-agreed timeline in a sequence that had been planned and rehearsed and refined across 18 months of scenario planning that nobody outside a very small circle knew was happening. The first instrument touched something that most people outside defense procurement circles have never thought about, and that the American defense establishment had been quietly monitoring with growing concern for longer than this dispute has been running. Canada supplies the United States with 23 of the 35 minerals designated as critical to American national defense by the Department of Defense's own critical minerals strategy. For 14 of those 23, Canada is not one option among several. Canada is the primary supplier, meaning the United States has no immediate alternative at the volumes and specifications that defense contractors and advanced manufacturers depend on. Not a comparable alternative, not an alternative that would require modest adjustment to accommodate. No immediate alternative at all. Canada placed 17 American defense-connected supply chains under formal government review. A review that under the amended statute can result in export restriction within 60 days without parliamentary approval. No floor debate required, no WTO notification window that would give affected parties time to seek emergency relief, no procedural buffer between the conclusion of the review and the implementation of whatever the review recommends. A self-contained administrative mechanism that was inserted into the amending legislation 18 months ago in language that received committee review but no floor debate, and was reported in none of the trade press that covers Canadian legislative developments. The carve-out that makes the mechanism work was not publicly noticed at the time of its insertion. It was a single paragraph in an amending bill that nobody was watching. And that paragraph means that any export restriction resulting from the review can take effect in days, not the 60 to 90-day WTO notification period that would normally give affected parties time to seek emergency relief. Days. The 60-day review timeline is not a grace period, it is a clock, running toward a decision point that carries no procedural buffer between decision and implementation, and no tariff adjustment that reverses what a restriction, once implemented, will have changed. The Pentagon understood this immediately. Within 6 hours of the order being published, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment had convened a working group to assess the exposure of the 5 named programs to supply interruption. Within 12 hours, preliminary briefing materials had reached the office of the Deputy National Security Advisor. The speed of that institutional response communicated something that had not been publicly visible before Thursday night: that the American defense establishment had already assessed Canadian critical mineral supply as a strategic vulnerability, that they had been monitoring this dispute's trajectory with the specific concern that escalation to the mineral domain was possible, that they had modeled the scenario, and that the monitoring had not prevented the scenario from arriving. The working group's preliminary conclusion was direct, in a way that preliminary conclusions from Pentagon working groups rarely are. For 3 of the 5 named programs, there is no short-term alternative supply at the volumes required. Not a difficult alternative, not an expensive alternative, no alternative. The review timeline of 60 days is 60 days in which 3 active defense programs operate with supply certainty dependent on a government review whose outcome is not determined and whose conclusion, if it recommends restriction, can be implemented before any legal or diplomatic response could be organized to address it. Armed Services Committee members who had received classified assurances that Canadian supply relationships for these programs were stable will now ask in their next classified briefing what the administration's current assessment of supply continuity is. The administration's honest answer is not an answer that a congressional committee charged with defense oversight will receive without consequence. And the strategic irony of what Thursday's critical minerals invocation revealed is precise enough to stop any serious defense planner mid-sentence. The United States has been working for years to develop Canadian supply as the primary alternative to Chinese-sourced critical minerals for defense applications. Precisely because Canadian supply offers Five Eyes partner reliability, geographic proximity, and legal framework compatibility that no other alternative source provides. Thursday's review invocation placed that carefully developed alternative supply under uncertainty at exactly the moment when American defense planners had been most actively reducing dependence on Chinese sources. The trade dispute that the administration prosecuted against its most reliable critical minerals partner has now placed the defense procurement diversification away from China under formal review by the partner it was meant to diversify toward. Every defense planner in Washington who understands that sentence has spent the time since Thursday calculating what it means for programs that cannot wait 60 days for a review's conclusion. The second instrument was designed to be felt, not analyzed, not modeled in a spreadsheet or discussed in a policy working group or assessed in a preliminary briefing that reaches the Deputy National Security Advisor 12 hours after the fact. Felt in a utility bill, in a manufacturing cost report that lands on a plant manager's desk in Michigan and contains a number that doesn't fit anywhere in the budget that was approved 6 months ago. In a congressional office on a Friday afternoon when the constituent calls are coming in faster than the staff can log them, and every single one of them is about the same thing. Canada's major energy provinces announced a coordinated pricing adjustment on cross-border electricity exports, raising the cost of power flowing into Minnesota, Michigan, Wisconsin, and New York by an average of 31%. 31%. Not a marginal adjustment, not a rounding error in the energy cost structure of the manufacturing facilities that depend on cross-border power. 31%. Effective at midnight, already transmitting through the grid before most of the people who would eventually bear its cost had any idea it had happened. Those 4 states have a combined representation of 22 Senate seats and 63 House seats. 22 Senate seats is nearly a quarter of the chamber. 63 House seats is nearly 15% of the House. The electricity pricing adjustment was not designed to resolve the dispute. It was not designed to produce a negotiating concession or a diplomatic breakthrough or a press conference where someone announces that progress has been made. It was designed to arrive with a number, a specific, concrete, unavoidable number that appears in a utility rate filing within weeks, and in an electricity bill within months, and in the manufacturing cost structure of an industrial facility within a single billing cycle. And that generates the specific kind of constituent pressure that congressional offices respond to faster and more directly than any other category of political communication. Not the diffuse pressure of higher prices spread across categories of goods that nobody traces back to a specific policy decision. The specific personal financial pressure of a number on a bill that is higher than last month's number by an amount that demands an explanation, and that a constituent is going to call their congressional office to ask about. 4 Republican senators from the affected states had called the White House by Friday evening. Sources described those calls as the most direct expressions of legislative concern about the tariff policy that any Republican senator had communicated since this dispute began. The calls were not public, their content was not disclosed, their number and their timing communicated everything their content would have confirmed. One senior Republican senator from Michigan, after receiving a preliminary industry estimate projecting that the 31% electricity cost increase would add between $2.1 billion and $2.9 billion in annual operating costs to Michigan's manufacturing sector within 12 months of full adjustment, said something that was circulating through congressional staff communications by Saturday morning. He described the estimate as the most alarming single-page document he had received in 14 years of Senate service. And then he said something that 7 words long, and that tells you more about where the internal political pressure on this policy is going than any public statement any senator has made about this dispute. He said, "This is not a trade dispute anymore. This is an industrial policy emergency." That sentence, spoken privately, attributed anonymously, circulating through the specific channels where the relationship between constituent pressure and legislative action gets managed, is a sentence that tells you the electricity pricing adjustment is already doing exactly what it was designed to do, and it has been in effect for less than 72 hours. The third instrument is the one that received the most measured initial coverage and carries the longest-term implications. The implications that will be least visible in the immediate news cycle and most significant in the account statements of the next several years for the largest number of ordinary Americans who have no idea any of this is happening. The Bank of Canada published a framework document, not a policy announcement, not a rate decision, not the kind of central bank communication that financial markets have learned to parse for immediate actionable information. A framework document, 18 pages of technical monetary policy language that in plain terms describes a timeline for moving a non-dollar currency settlement architecture from its current pilot phase, processing approximately $12 billion in monthly transaction volume, to full operational capacity, processing the $74 billion in monthly transaction volume that represents the framework's design capacity. The acceleration timeline the document proposes would reach full operational capacity in 14 months, rather than the previously projected 36. A 22-month acceleration of a structural dollar demand reduction on a timeline that no tariff adjustment, no diplomatic resolution, no change in the political environment that produced this dispute can reverse once the infrastructure reaches operational maturity. Because infrastructure built to process $74 billion monthly in non-dollar settlement does not unbuild when the political environment changes. It processes $74 billion monthly and continues to process it after the press conferences are over and the statements have been forgotten and the specific tariff schedules that produce this dispute have been adjusted or removed or replaced with something else. The financial significance of the acceleration is not primarily the volume, though 74 billion monthly is not a number that can be dismissed. The significance is the signal. A central bank publishes an implementation framework when it intends to implement. The Bank of Canada published this framework at 6 in the morning, 3 hours after the critical minerals review was invoked, 6 hours after the electricity pricing adjustment took effect. The sequencing was not coincidental. It was the final element of an architecture that was designed from the beginning to be read as a whole. 3 instruments arriving together, communicating together, telling every financial market and every government watching the same thing in language that required no translation. The restructuring is not a threat. It is a schedule. And the schedule is already running. When Warren Buffett received a briefing on what Canada had done and transmitted his assessment to Berkshire Hathaway's institutional investor network at 7:15 in the morning, it contained a single line that was circulating in every fixed income trading room in North America by 8 o'clock. Canada didn't escalate. Canada restructured. Those are different actions with different consequences, and the market is going to spend the next several months understanding the difference. His full assessment was described by sources close to Berkshire as the most carefully drafted response he had issued to a single day's developments in the trade dispute. It opened with a distinction that became the organizing principle of everything that followed, and that cuts to the center of why Thursday night is different from everything that preceded it in this dispute. Escalation is additive. You add tariffs, the other side adds tariffs. The costs accumulate and the negotiating space narrows. And eventually someone blinks, or someone doesn't, and the dispute either resolves or escalates further. But the underlying structure of the relationship remains unchanged throughout. The dependency map looks the same at the end of the escalation cycle as it did at the beginning. The foundation didn't move. Restructuring is architectural. You change the foundation on which the relationship rests. And when the foundation changes, everything built on it changes with it. Infrastructure built to replace a supply chain dependency does not unbuild when the trade dispute resolves. A currency settlement framework operating at full capacity does not revert to dollar-denominated clearing because a tariff schedule is adjusted. Critical Minerals Review Authority, once exercised, does not extinguish when the specific review concludes. The foundation changes. The structure above it is now different, whether the political environment that produced the change remains or not. He translated the restructuring into the economic language that institutional investors depend on for their exposure assessments. In 60 years of watching bilateral trade relationships, I have learned to distinguish the events that change the headline from the events that change the structure. Thursday changed the structure. 3 repricing events in one night. The Critical Minerals Review, creating supply uncertainty for defense programs that had been priced as fully certain. The electricity pricing adjustment, creating immediate and specific cost increases for manufacturing constituencies in 4 states representing nearly a quarter of the Senate. The Bank of Canada's framework document, accelerating by 22 months the timeline on which $74 billion in monthly transaction volume stops generating dollar demand. One night. 3 repricing events. In 60 years, I have not seen a trade counterattack this precisely targeted or this architecturally significant. His verdict was 6 words. Canada found America's foundation. Thursday. 6 words. No elaboration. The elaboration was already published. It was the 18 pages of the Bank of Canada's framework document, the 60-day Critical Minerals Review timeline, the 31% electricity price increase already transmitting through the grid before the first analysis piece had been written. The market consequences of Thursday's 3-component counterattack developed through Friday, with the specific character of consequences that sophisticated institutional participants had modeled as a tail risk and were now repricing as a baseline scenario. Tail risk to baseline repricing is not a single session event. It is a multi-week process of exposure reassessment that manifests in gradual, persistent, directional market movement rather than a dramatic single-day crash. The automotive sector declined. The most direct expression of the supply chain dependency repricing that the Critical Minerals Review initiated for the components feeding the assembly lines that depend on Canadian mineral inputs. The energy sector declined, led by utilities with significant cross-border transmission exposure to the 4 states affected by the electricity pricing adjustment. The dollar declined against the basket of currencies composing the Asia-Pacific settlement framework in what currency strategists described as the market beginning to price the acceleration timeline the Bank of Canada's framework document established. 3 sectors, 3 declines, 3 instruments. The market understood the architecture Thursday built before the first analysis piece had been published. There is something deeper happening here than a trade dispute. And it deserves a serious answer to a question that most of the coverage of Thursday's events is not asking. For years, the assumption underlying American trade policy toward Canada was that the asymmetry of the bilateral economic relationship, Canada's greater dependence on American markets, constituted a permanent and stable leverage advantage. Utilities with cross-border transmission infrastructure in the 4 affected states, energy companies whose cost structures depend on cross-border electricity pricing stability, and the defense contractors whose procurement timelines for 3 active programs now carry supply uncertainty where certainty was priced. The repricing that began in the markets on Friday is not a single session event. It is the first quarterly installment of a cumulative repricing that will develop across every earnings cycle for which the Critical Minerals Review remains unresolved. Every billing cycle in which the 31% electricity adjustment compounds into industrial cost structures. Every month in which the Bank of Canada's accelerated settlement framework moves closer to the operational capacity that eliminates a structural source of dollar demand. The manufacturing worker in Michigan, whose retirement account includes diversified industrial exposure. The teacher in Wisconsin, whose pension fund holds positions in utilities serving the Great Lakes grid. The retiree in New York, whose savings are invested in energy companies dependent on cross-border pricing stability. They are not exposed to Thursday in a way that appears on any account statement this week. They are exposed in a way that will appear with compounding precision in the account statements of the next several years. They didn't make the decisions that created this situation. They had no visibility into the trade policy calculations or the leverage map assessments or the 18 months of scenario planning on either side. They just built their retirements around the assumption that the economic relationships their savings depend on were stable. That assumption is now being tested in ways that will not produce a headline this week and will not be traceable to a specific decision by the time they appear in an account statement. That is always how it works. And that is the part of this story that deserves more attention than it is getting. There is a principle that every serious student of economic statecraft understands about the relationship between leverage and dependency. Leverage does not reside in the size of an economy. It resides in the asymmetry of dependency. In the specific question of who needs what from whom in ways that cannot be quickly or cheaply replaced. In the specific territories of a dependency map where the alternatives are thin and the timelines for developing them are long, and the political cycles of the governments involved are short. The United States has operated for years on the assumption that the asymmetry of the bilateral relationship was a single number that ran in one direction. What Thursday demonstrated is that the map is more complicated than that number suggested, that it has territories the larger economy does not control. That 18 months of careful planning by a smaller economy that decided to stop fighting on terrain that favored its opponent can redraw a leverage map in ways that take a single night to execute and considerably longer to reverse. The international dimension of Thursday's counterattack registered with the precision that sophisticated allied governments bring to developments that carry direct implications for their own bilateral positioning with Washington. Japan, South Korea, Australia, the United Kingdom, each of which has its own complex trade relationship with the American administration, and each of which has been watching the Canadian dispute as a leading indicator of what their own relationships may eventually face. Each of those governments processed Thursday's 3 instruments with the specific analytical interest of governments that are simultaneously allies of the United States and participants in trade frameworks whose architecture has just been demonstrated to be a more effective pressure instrument than bilateral tariff retaliation. The Bank of Canada's acceleration of the Asia-Pacific Settlement Framework's operational timeline is directly relevant to the 5 co-signatories of the framework, 3 of whom have their own unresolved trade tensions with Washington. An acceleration of the timeline on which the settlement framework reaches full operational capacity is an acceleration of the timeline on which those 3 governments gain a functional non-dollar clearing alternative at scale. Thursday's framework document was published in Ottawa. Its implications were read in Tokyo and Seoul before Friday's Asian markets opened. That is the international dimension of what Canada built. An architecture whose implications extend beyond the bilateral relationship it was designed to address, and whose reach into the trade positioning of every government watching this dispute is something that no tariff adjustment in the bilateral relationship will reverse. So where does this leave us right now, with the instruments deployed and the clock running and the leverage map redrawn and the administration without a public response that addresses any element of what Thursday actually built? It leaves us at a genuine inflection point. One of those rare moments in a long, complicated story where the next development is genuinely unpredictable, where the outcome hasn't been determined yet by the accumulated momentum of what came before, where decisions being made in government offices and central bank meeting rooms and congressional war rooms over the next days and weeks will actually matter in ways that feel real and consequential and irreversible in ways that earlier decisions in this dispute did not. The 60-day critical minerals review timeline is the number that matters most right now, because when that clock expires, the review will either conclude with export restriction or it will not. And that conclusion will determine whether Thursday was a warning shot or the opening round of a dispute that has entered territory neither side mapped before Canada spent 18 months doing the mapping. The outcome of that review will not arrive with fanfare. It will not be announced at a press conference or delivered in a strongly worded statement. It will arrive in an administrative document published quietly in Ottawa in the dry, technical language that turns most people's eyes glassy. The kind of document that gets filed and generates exactly zero attention until suddenly everyone understands what it meant. And by then, the foundation will have shifted again. Because that is how restructuring works. Not with noise, not with spectacle, not with the theatrical energy of a press conference designed to signal resolve to an audience that is watching for exactly that signal. With architecture. With instruments designed in advance and executed on a deliberate timeline and targeted at the specific places where the structure beneath the surface is most exposed and least replaceable. Canada found those places, spent 18 months mapping them, built instruments precise enough to land on them without the broad disruption that would make the counterattack as costly to the side deploying it as to the side absorbing it, and then deployed those instruments on a single night in a sequence designed to be read as a whole. The leverage map has been redrawn. The clock is running. And the question that will define what comes next is not whether the administration finds a response. It is whether the response it finds engages with the foundation that was restructured, or with the surface that was always easier to see. One way or another, the answer is coming. And when it arrives, it will not just tell us something about this trade dispute. It will tell us something about whether the assumption of permanent leverage advantage that underlies a certain approach to economic relationships with smaller partners actually holds when the smaller partner decides to stop fighting on terrain that favors the larger one and starts fighting on terrain it spent 18 months carefully choosing. That answer is closer now than it was before Thursday. The clock is running, and the foundation has already moved.